Now, they had a parallel project going on with certain other aspects, in which the transmitter site had to have a receiving site. Now, the receiving site was not in the same location. They moved it about 30 miles away to Southampton, Long Island, and there they had the gigantic receiver site, which is still essentially there. The transmitter site was demolished and converted into a industrial park, which is all you see now is an industrial park from about 87 onward. But in that site, some strange things went on, and the story of how the project came down is even stranger. Might be worth noting. We had to track back, and Preston Nichols was very heavy in this because he's a radio amateur and he's in the radio amateur clubs. And he had been by that place many times, and one October night, with he, Duncan, and myself in his van, headed up to the place. He wanted to show me this vast transmitter site. He says, I don't think we can get on in there, but it's there. Well, the gates were wide open. The guards were gone. The power was off. So we drove in and drove around and wandered all through the place. And they had not yet started demolishing the main transmitter building. They had demolished some of the smaller buildings peripherally, which may have had some manufacturing facilities. We're not sure. But we went through that, saw all of the transmitters, and there were some very strange charges left on them. Eventually, of course, the amateurs were invited in to strip the place, take anything they wanted, because it would save the contractor the trouble of removing it. So the amateurs had a field day. They took down 5 towers, 120 feet high with the rotating antennas. They saved the antennas. They took everything you can imagine. And when they were done, they still had literally tens of tons of hardware to scrap. The transmitters eventually were bulldozed, what was left of them. But we couldn't understand why this place shut down, because it was a functioning overseas communication system. Well, finally, the story filtered through from ITT Corporation's headquarters at Maiden Lane, New York, about a very strange occurrence in one night in September, actually a Saturday. ITT had planned to shut this facility down on a permanent basis because they really had a little more use for it. And that particular morning on a Saturday, they gave instructions by phone to the station master that this was to be the last day of transmission. There would be some traffic that would come through, and they would have shut down and secure the transmitter on a permanent basis. So he received his orders, and throughout the rest of the day and far into the night, the transmitter remained on, and it was receiving traffic, and nobody at the Nutley end or New York could figure out what was going on. They had orders to shut down the station, and it was not shut down. It was accepting traffic and transmitting. So they sent somebody out from New York to investigate, and he arrived that night and started to go on base and took one look and said, I ain't going on this place. The transmitter building, with all of the transmitters, which was quite a large structure, was glowing with a blue glow over it, something which was totally abnormal. He wouldn't walk on the base. It was surrounded with gates and fences and all of this. He wouldn't go on the base at all, and he went to a telephone and called Nutley and said, there's something very strange going on here. I refuse to set foot on base because of this very weird blue glow, and it just doesn't seem normal at all. And attempts from Nutley to contact any of the personnel on the base in the latter part of the afternoon, the early evening, were futile. They got no answers on the phone. So they said, okay, don't go on base. We'll come by with a crew in the morning, and we'll shut down the power from the substation outside the operating area, which they did. And then they went on base. Nothing wrong, everything appearing perfectly normal. All the equipment was there. 12 people on that base earlier in the day had vanished completely and were never found. Not a trace. They finally had to tell the families that these people had disappeared. How they handled it, I don't know. But about 3 days later, they fired up the equipment to see if there's anything wrong with it. They found nothing wrong with it, whatever. Every piece of equipment on that base operated properly, but nobody was there. So ITT shut it down and did a little head scratching and finally says, okay, we don't have anything more to do with this place, get rid of it. So that was when the order came to sell it. They found somebody who was a developer of industrial properties, and they bought it lock, stock, and barrel for $5 million cash. They finally found out how much they paid for it. And ITT told him, you get everything. He says, we don't want all this transmitting gear. He says, you got it all. We don't want it. It's your problem. So that's when came the famous offer to the radio amateurs to come in and have at it and take anything they wanted. And they did for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then, of course, eventually everything was torn up and the transmitters were destroyed, the buildings were leveled. I was there when they were doing it. And the underground facilities, and there were some extensive underground rooms, they were so strong that they supported the bulldozers without bending at all. What they did with that, I don't know. But they eventually cleared everything, and it's now a large industrial site, and there's no trace of the old transmitter towers, the buildings, or the site. But that story was weird in that whatever was going on at that station, apparently the station or something connected with it wasn't about to be shut down. So into the blue went about 12 people, somewhat reminiscent of what happened at Montauk not too long before, except there it was a different phenomena. So that's some of the strange things that have turned up in Long Island in the process.
This reminds me of these additional byproducts of the Philadelphia technology way back in the 40s when seamen were disappearing off the deck of the Eldridge, and then somebody else appeared, another seaman appeared in Italy, buried in a brick wall. Then that barroom fight with
Yes.
the crewmen that came out of nowhere.
You know, those are all interesting stories. The one about the barroom fight is documented. I do have the newspaper clipping finally, which documents a group of sailors coming out of, as they put it in the paper, the rear room of the barroom, fighting and engaging in a brawl, and involved themselves with the customers in the bar, and bar stools were overturned and things were damaged, and they estimated $600 worth of damage, which was quite a lot of damage in 1943. And the MPs and the SPs were called, and the police and the shore patrol hauled off the sailors, and the Navy said they would pay for the damage that was done. The only problem with the story was there was no back room in the bar. There was nothing but a wall. And it would appear that these sailors came out of the wall, probably connected with the Philadelphia experiment. We don't really know, as has never been run down for the ultimate answer as to where they came from. The other story I've heard once, and I've not been able to get any data on it, is that about the same time a sailor, an American one, turned up buried in a brick wall someplace in Italy. Quite dead when discovered, but the body was half buried in the brick itself. And this was very reminiscent of what happened on the Eldridge, where 4 bodies were buried in the steel, 2 horizontally in the deck and 2 vertically in the bulkhead walls. So the phenomenon that was created by the Philadelphia experiment in the final test was enormous. It was very far-reaching and was very, very destructive of many things. And we perhaps do not yet know the full story of what it really did. But we do know that the Navy, of course, wouldn't leave it alone. Eventually had to pick it up again in 47, which I've already outlined.
I remember a story here, a very interesting story that I heard on American radio, American Forces Radio in Japan in the late 70s, about a big rock that was a program on unexplained phenomena, Fortean phenomena. One night, a big rock, huge boulder appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the city square of a American city on the East Coast. Next morning, all the city elders gathered. The rock was so big they couldn't haul it in any truck. They had to cut it in pieces or to dynamite it. Scientists were called in, and one of them said, well, maybe this is a materialization of some material out of a different dimension. And I said, nah, different dimension, my left foot. That was almost 20 years ago, when I have absolutely no idea about time travel, about different parallel dimensions and so on. Yeah, the 14 phenomena were absolute taboo in Eastern Europe and still are widely unknown. But the program ended with the words, and the name of this scientist was Albert Einstein, and I clearly remember to this day cold ants crawling down my back, because I realized that there may be something more serious to this rather than just a simple joke. Then I remember another story in a science fiction magazine. My personal feeling is that many of the science fiction stories that we read, and even many of the tabloid reports that we read, and that the supermarket checkout lines are daily bombarded with these messages. I'm subscribed to most of the tabloid papers, and the Weekly World News is my favorite one. My feeling is that this is a very subtle way of manipulation and of education of the whole society. It works on a principle similar to the immunization of an organism with a weakened poison or a weakened disease, so that the organism can develop its antibodies. In this case, the lowest strata of society that doesn't read anything else but tabloid papers serve as this sacrificial lamb that is exposed to the dangerous, threatening information, and through many years of such bombardment, they finally learn to live with UFOs visiting us every day, or the government manipulating space, manipulating time, manipulating the genetic code, creating hybrids between humans and animals, between humans and aliens. And in many ways, the science fiction literature has been serving the same purpose. There are so many stories that are written after a carefully orchestrated or designer leak, as I call them sometimes, happens, and some intelligence official contacts his friend, who happens to be a writer, and a nice best-selling story or short story or novel appears on the book, on the market after some time. So in this science fiction story, two British constables discovered one night a talking head that was appearing, protruding out of the pavement and smiling and talking to them. And little by little, more and more human parts and whole and half bodies and whole bodies appeared out of the pavement, out of bricks, out of walls, out of ceilings, out of everywhere. So this is a very interesting attempt to acquaint the public with the possibility that it is possible to walk through walls, that it is not that difficult and dangerous. And obviously these are signs that secret programs have been going on behind the scenes. For me, every story that I read in the tabloid papers is an indication that some research of that type is going on somewhere behind the scenes, and somebody is interested in educating the whole society, so that 20 or 50 years later, when this research would be put out in the open, in public, in the academia, there wouldn't be a massive panic or suicides. What other byproducts, I mean negative byproducts of the Philadelphia experiment would you comment upon? Or maybe some of these first nuclear tests that we were talking today that had some very interesting starry effects?
Well, we can go into the nuclear test program, but first I would point out the phenomena which has been discussed and described is certainly not new to this century. Charles Fort, who was an ordinary newspaper reporter a century and a half ago in England, would start investigating some of these strange occurrences and reports he heard, and of course, like most other people at the time, was very skeptical, but started clipping these newspaper files, and he wound up with some 50 or 100 shoeboxes full of clippings, which wound up being eventually the property of the Fortean Society. He wrote a series of books, Land of the Damned, and a few others, in which he concluded that basically we might be the property of somebody else. But he documented so many of these strange occurrences, like frogs falling out of the heaven, fish falling out of the heavens on the ground, and other strange falls, even parts of bathrooms, of sinks and what have you, angel hair, animals, just coming out of nowhere. There has to be an explanation, but none could be found at that time, and the scientists, of course, ignored it. These things have been going on through quite a period of time, and they're not new to us. But this sort of thing continues, and we have these barroom brawls, which may have been induced by hardware that we controlled. Who knows what caused these other phenomena 100 years ago? When we came on to the era of the nuclear energy, where we dropped the bombs in Japan, we had atomic tests in the Pacific in 1946 and 47, which were essentially ordinary atomic bombs. I use that term ordinary advisedly. because they kept growing in size and power. But in 1952, with Edward Teller having created it, they were ready to test the first hydrogen bomb. And in 1954, they tested a second one. And what I remember, if my dates are correct, was the second test they had an enormous problem with. They decided they wanted a 3-mile-long tunnel to instrument the rate of propagation of the explosion. And it was very carefully instrumented with very precise equipment, because EG&G instruments all of these tests, has from the year one and still is to this day. No one else will or can, because they control all the patents. But in any case, all of this very nice equipment was built, and measurement equipment and time zero markers and so forth, and high-speed cameras. So they detonated the device, and as the photos from Life magazine showed, and some of the movie films they showed, a mushroom started to form at the island where the device was in a building, and then all of a sudden it was full-blown, full-size, and covered more than the island. The measurements down the tunnels they expected would take about 18 microseconds for propagation if c is the maximum speed of travel of light or anything in this universe, according to Einstein's theory. Well, the bomb went off, and it was t equals 0 everywhere, as there was no propagation rate. It was instantaneous to the end of the 3-mile tunnels while they lasted. And this threw all of the physicists into a tizzy. They literally threw out the physics books and says, well, we're back to square one, we start over. And none of the physics we know works or means anything anymore. And of course, one of the other aspects was Life somehow got a hold of the photos, and as the huge, not mushroom cloud, but hemispherical glowing sphere of light with strange patterns in it started to rise and thin, the aerial cameras which are photographing this whole thing caught some very strange phenomena. You could see from the camera and from the pictures which were published by Life that you were looking through the fireball into what was apparently another universe. They were seeing stars. I never forgot that when I saw that in a published issue of Life, and I found out later from channels Life was almost put out of business over that. They were very severely reprimanded. However, they didn't even know how they got a hold of the photos, but they did, and they published, which I think the public has a right to know, but the military didn't feel the same way about it, particularly the AEC.
Who cares about the public?
Right, who cares about the public seems to be the attitude. They never detonated another hydrogen bomb. There's a simple reason.
This was the last one?
54 was the last one. They scheduled one for 56, but it was never detonated. They canceled it because it was to be an underwater test, and they decided, in view of what happened with the 54 test, where not only did they lose the 3-mile tunnels, but the entire island was vaporized, and it went down and burning and boiling down to bedrock, and it was burning and boiling at bedrock for 3 days afterwards, till the ocean water finally damped it out.
So basically they started kind of a chain
They
reaction in the
started a chain reaction in the rock, which certain scientists had so warned, and others said, oh, poo-poo, this can't possibly happen. And those who poo-pooed it, of course, were those who ran the tests, and they were performed, and they found out it can happen.
And they were afraid that the second explosion may ignite the very water of the oceans and explode the planet.
They were afraid of this for the simple reason that H2O is the most common substance on Earth, the most common compound, and it's everywhere. And if somehow they were managed to start a chain reaction in the water itself, it would go through the entire oceans everywhere, and that would be essentially the end of the Earth. They did not, fortunately, set off such a reaction. Whether it's damped by minerals or whatever else, I don't know, but they were fortunate in that did not happen. So all further tests were abandoned. And, of course, the Russians start their H-bomb tests.
And because the Americans didn't give them the data, they had to repeat everything again.
Exactly. So they had their one and only test, which I believe was about 1959. And they expected, according to the reports which came even from Khrushchev later, about a 30 megaton yield. They got a little bit more, something they would never admit how much, but it was in excess of 100 megatons. And the Russians said they would never set off another hydrogen bomb again, because it was totally out of control, so far as they were concerned. Their mathematical models, their predictions, their so-called nuclear theory was a pile of garbage. They don't really know what's going on, and I know personally a nuclear physicist. He's published 125 papers, and used to teach at USC Berkeley, who said the same thing. He says the nuclear scientists have no idea what's going on. They don't know what's going on with nuclear processes, period. And this from a nuclear physicist.
This is the famous explosion on an island in the sea north of Siberia, in basically the northern ocean. That was so powerful that it broke the needles on the seismographs, not only in Russia but in many other countries. The earthquake created by it was so powerful.
Well, that one I did not hear of. I most certainly don't hear of everything, and that's why it's necessary for people to get together and compare notes and do networking. Today, the networking via computers is what's getting information around faster than it can be stopped, because you cannot stop the network if the computers are on. It's nationwide. And all of the little computer bulletin boards, which are maintained privately. And this kind of information does get out. Back in the 50s, there were no computers and computer networks. It had to be verbal.
Talking about nuclear bombs, I was very interested when you mentioned that there are persistent rumors and even comments by some major physicists, Oppenheimer included, that the two devices that were exploded over Japan were actually of German origin, of German production.
This was alluded to by a German who was writing or connected with the book that was published in Toronto, Canada, outlining the history of the UFO development in Germany, and also making some passing reference to the nuclear program which Germany had ongoing during World War II. And it was known, it was found out after the war was over, it was known that the Germans had developed and had built a number of atomic bombs which were in their arsenal and apparently never used. And they were working on a super bomb of a totally unknown design, which they were going to plan to use on New York or London, probably London or New York, whichever they chose to wipe out first, which according to the reports, a single bomb about the size of a pineapple was sufficient to wipe out the entire city, which is to say it was more powerful than the hydrogen bombs which were yet to be invented. But this
could easily be an anti-matter bomb.
Very possibly. That's about the only thing that would do it. The German technology was so far advanced beyond ours, it's unbelievable, and it's unbelievable that they lost the war. But they did. And perhaps better for all of us that that did happen. But their technology was very advanced, and they were into these areas. Now, the reports were that, and this was allegedly admitted by Oppenheimer after the war was over, that the two bombs we dropped on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki we did not build. Because we had an extreme shortage of plutonium. There was not enough plutonium to cover the head of a pin in May of 1945, and which was when Germany surrendered. It was May of 45? Yes.
May 45.
And by the time we came around to dropping the bomb in 46, there was a lot of time in between.
No, actually 45, August 45.
It was August 45, okay. There was a few months in between, and it was in that interim period that we suddenly were able to develop a bomb which was dropped, or actually not dropped, but tested at Trinity, New Mexico, allegedly the first nuclear device we had built. And within a few weeks after that, we dropped two bombs on Japan. The question is quite well asked. If we were so short of nuclear materials, they had enough uranium-235 to build bombs, but those were the huge devices like Fat Man, or Fat Boy as they called it, which required a gun barrel to bring the two charges of parts together.
A howitzer barrel.
A howitzer-type barrel, especially made by the Navy. And it was not a particularly high-yield device, and it was rather sloppy, but at least it proved the principle. The question is, did we carry something like that over Japan, or did they drop one of those, and it was later claimed the Nagasaki bomb was actually a plutonium bomb? I can't prove it at this point, but I do know there were enough records at Los Alamos, where I was at the end of the war, to show that the Germans had developed quite a few nuclear devices. And that was not unknown up there at that time.
What is your explanation of why Hitler didn't use these devices at the end of the war?
I would say there is no good explanation unless you were to totally modify your view of what Hitler's real character was, his real nature of the person. He has been painted, of course, by many news media, continuing to this day, of course, as being a monster, a person without any feeling or heart, who's out to conquer the world. All of the records today show he was not out to conquer the world, and there's the actual military aspects of the weapons development in Germany were very peculiar. They would not release a weapon into general use in the German military until they had already produced a countermeasures weapon. There was no countermeasures of any type to an atomic bomb. Not at least they were known at that time or now. That is, after the bomb is triggered and set off, there is no countermeasures. The only countermeasure is that you don't set it off. It may have been for that reason that Hitler refused to use it. So it's a speculation, of course, at this point. If he had it and he was losing the war, why didn't he use it as a military weapon? He many times ignored the advice of his own military high staff because he got into the area of the Aryan racial considerations, the racial superiority, and when the British were on the beach at Dunkirk waiting to be evacuated back to England after they were driven into the sea, the German high command wanted to kill all of the British because, after all, they were soldiers and there was a war on, and there's about 500,000, and there were prime targets and legitimate targets in terms of war to be eliminated, as you would eliminate any army in the field. Hitler interceded and says, no, you will not attack them, you will let them escape. They're Aryans, you don't kill Aryans. That was his thinking at the time. The British survived, of course, and some Australians and others with them. And the end result, of course, they lived to come back to Europe another day, which, of course, did happen. But he had some very peculiar philosophies, and one among them was he did not want to wipe out necessarily a lot of Aryans, which he considered the British as being. So one has to take another look, no matter how difficult it may be, at some of Hitler's philosophy and find out where his head was really at, because you will not get a true picture from the current propaganda or the ongoing propaganda from the end of World War II or during World War II. Much of the propaganda that was against Hitler from our side after we were in the war, of course, portrayed him as a beast. But remember two things. Hitler never had a bodyguard. He had military around him, but he never carried bodyguards around with him like every president in the United States does, particularly in the last two administrations. And number two, when he went anywhere in Germany, the children all ran up to him. They actually loved him. And children have a way of knowing psychically when somebody is evil. Now, if they didn't shun him and they ran up to him on a regular basis, you cannot stage manage this all the time. You can stage manage it perhaps a good part of the time. But all of the newsreels are there as testimony. He went all over Germany, sometimes very much alone, without bodyguards, would hike in the mountains alone. If that man was so evil and so hated, why did the German people not attack him?
Very similar to the way Russian children would rush to Stalin and shower him with flowers and kisses and hugs. It's an interesting way of how a totalitarian country can manipulate its population, and through propaganda can paint a picture of a person being the father of a nation.
True, and he was, in the case of Hitler, he was considered not only the Führer, the leader, he was considered in many respects the father of the new nation, the Third Reich, and that he had made many promises and he kept them all, namely guns and butter. He would pull the nation out of the poverty it had been in, rebuild the nation, rearm it. He did all of these things. Regardless of how he did them, he did them. And regardless of the concentration camps, the people who were dissidents, he did reunify Germany and keep his promises. And he also kept another basic promise, which was the reason why he achieved power in the first place, was he promised to throw all of the Bolsheviks and all of the communists out of Germany, and he did. They were threatening to take over Germany in 1928-29. It was a very serious movement, a communist movement in Germany at that time before he acceded to full power. He was in a semi-full power from 1930 on, but when the burning of the Reichstag, and he became
which actually was ignited by 3 Bulgarians that were on trial in Leipzig for the burning down of the Reichstag.
That part I wouldn't
But
know.
that's another long story.
Right.
Other than the Bulgarian involvement, as usual, in not only the killing of the Pope and burning of the Reichstag, but in other famous espionage affairs in Europe, I would like you to comment if you have any information about particular extraterrestrial race involvement with the Germans. I've heard about crash saucers in Peenemünde or elsewhere in the Bavarian Alps. I've heard about some races coming and getting disillusioned and going from Germany.
Well, there's a great deal of information, and Billy Myers is a source of quite a bit of it, that the Pleiadians approached Hitler, a specific group of Pleiadians, approached Hitler in 1933-34, and eventually, after first approaching the U.S. and being rejected by Roosevelt, they went to Germany, made a deal with Hitler to provide him with technology and help build up the nation. And their price and requirement was that he would take a very easy stand and no rough stuff in handling the Jewish problem, which he said, we know you have. But he says, there'll be no rough stuff. Now, Hitler in that day readily agreed to it, because history shows that in the period up through 1940-41, there was no rough treatment of the Jewish and other dissidents in the concentration camps. In fact, they were treated quite well.
And that there were plans to repatriate all of them to Madagascar, that island south of.
Right, there was that plan, and of course the Madagascarans apparently rejected it. They wanted no part of it. But in any case, there were plans to do this. The National Socialist Party, in the period prior to World War II, did not and could not conceive of a massacre of the Jewish people. They knew it was a problem, they wanted to get rid of them, but they didn't know how to do it, and it was an endless debate. But quite aside from this, the Pleiadians said they would provide them with technology, and there was the rumor and the story of a crash saucer that came down in the Bavarian Alps in sometime in late 1935, which was a source of a lot of German technology. Now, this story has been repeated many times by people who came from Peenemünde who found the wreckage of a UFO in Germany after the war was over.
In the same place or at Peenemünde?
At Peenemünde.
So this is the second crash.
I don't know if it's the second one or not. But they found the parts and pieces for it, and they knew that the Germans had some kind of outside help. Now, from what I understand, the operation with the Pleiadians, they provided some personnel also, went ahead, they developed fast new technologies, and they moved very rapidly in developing their own technology, and some highly advanced technology, which included circular foil aircraft, which started to show up in the research areas in 1937-38, were actually being built as early as 1939, replicas of the Pleiadian craft, but not with the Pleiadian drive. What I understand, they never did solve the Pleiadian drive system, but developed their own. Victor Schaumburger, who is well known for his contributions technically to the flying saucer, circular foil aircraft, if you will, technology, is known throughout the world for his aircraft designs and the circular foil aircraft designs. Eventually developed a true electromagnetic anti-gravity drive, and this came in the latter part of the war. But this one basically all stems from the Pleiadian giving of technology to Germany and a lot of other ideas. How much was given, we don't really know. But I understand that about 1941, for whatever reason, the Pleiadians pulled out. They would no longer support Hitler. And in its stead came via, the information came via a respected channel that I know of, and I do not mean a metaphysical channel, but a very physical, real channel, an ex-agent of the government, U.S., who knew Germans during the period right after World War II, and they used to tell the stories about how the Greys made a deal with Hitler, the little 3.5-foot Greys, allegedly, and gave him technology, and they wanted humans to experiment on. And the stories are that Hitler told them, he says, you can't have any of the Germans, the Aryans, but he says, you can take all the people you want out of the concentration camps. I don't give a hoot about them. And they did. I am told that there was a large discrepancy in count between the records of those who went into the camps, those who came out alive, those who were there dead, in which they had skull bones and other evidence of who had died there. There was still a large number unaccounted for. What percentage, I don't know. It may well be that the Greys took some of them out of the camps for their own genetic experimentations under Germany. The second largest area of Grey invasion is in Europe. The primary area is in the U.S. But this is just another side issue.
I've been thinking about this crash landing of UFOs when an alien nation wants to establish contact with a particular planetary race. It has many functions to it. For example, when a disabled UFO is left in the middle of a field, it is like a huge dead bear being found in the middle of or a dead bee is being found in the middle of a primitive village on the morning. People are afraid of it, but eventually they overcome their fear. They start dancing over it, and little by little they develop their stories of how to fight these beasts. So my feeling is that these are all engineered crashes, and these are old surplus ships that are left on the planet for the locals to explore and to slowly get over the fear. If it is a live UFO with live aliens coming out of it, it would be a panic similar to what Orson Welles caused with his dramatization of The War of the Worlds. Another interesting detail here is that many times the aliens conclude a treaty with a government, but with the very top echelon. Less than probably 10 or 20 people in the whole country know that there is a treaty with aliens, and that information is being transferred from their civilization to ours. And so crash landing of a UFO is an interesting explanation for the lower echelons of the engineers and the military of this sudden explosion of new ideas, new solutions that come literally out of nowhere, as we have all seen. And especially I was astonished myself in my research of the last year, starting very skeptically to research the rumors of German UFOs, and only in 1 year discovering more than 50, 60 different models of flying craft powered with every possible engine that we know of, and some other impossible engines that the Germans built especially for the UFOs. So my point is that such crashes are organized, engineered, so that to explain away this sudden explosion and cornucopia of new technologies to the rest of the engineering elite, without having to reveal to everybody that, oh yes, yeah, we are in contact with aliens.
Well, it's a very interesting point, because the cover-up that has persisted throughout history, and I'm not talking about modern history in the last 50 or 100 years, but throughout history, all of the researchers have shown, whether you quote G. Cope Shellhorn, who is a PhD and a biblical scholar, and has shown that UFOs have existed throughout the ages, going back at least 5,000, maybe 10,000 years, and there's ample evidence of it. There has always been somebody here that's been contacted, and it usually is going to prove to be that it was the kings, the priests, or those of the highest echelons of government. And they didn't want the general public to know that they were trafficking with aliens, if you will, and for whatever purpose or reason. Now, in the current era, let us say the last 100 years, you have the same problem. There were aliens around this planet. And in the period of more modern history, which I would say, let us say from the time of the fall of Atlantis, or the destruction of Atlantis, which many people may still dispute, and a lot of scientists want to dispute, but there's more than ample evidence if you know where to dig. Atlantis was apparently destroyed by outside intervention, which produced the cataclysmic earthquakes which finally sank the last island. But in the process after that, a governing body on Earth was set up, which is now known as, and has been known for centuries and millennia, as the Order of the Illuminati. The Illuminati is a strange organization. It has its current world headquarters, and has had it for at least 500 years at Basel, Switzerland. But in the earlier days it was elsewhere, and it went back actually to the days after the collapse of Atlantis. And there's a governing body within it of 3 people. 2 were always humans, and the third was always a reptilian. Which is to say, there is an outside influence in the affairs of Earth and has been for at least 10,000 years, a direct influence. And the rest of the orders, apparently, for the progress of humanity to what is to go on here, would appear from outside. Today, the Order of the Illuminati is not the only secret organization. There are many. We have the not-so-secret, but of course it has the secret aspects to it, the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. We have the Trilateral Commission. We have the Club of Rome, which is not well known, but the think tank for the whole operation of the secret societies and groups.
And the limitation of the population and all these populations.
They have generated the programs, and you have the Bilderbergers, and interlocked with all of this, of course, is the Order of the Illuminati. They have been setting policy, along with the so-called elite, the wealthiest people on Earth, for more than a year or two, and more than 100 years or two. It's been going on for centuries, because the old money of Europe, as they call it, is not 400 or 500 years old. It's perhaps 1,000 years old. You have to consider the de Medicis of Italy and some of the other families which are unknown totally to the outside world today, which have trillions of dollars in wealth. As only one example, the Habsburgs of Germany and of Europe have enormous wealth. It's uncounted. It's in the trillions. They have gold reserves of staggering quantities. It would make Fort Knox look like a toy playpen. At Fort Knox, it doesn't have any gold now anymore, but in any case, when it did have a gold reserve stock, what the Habsburgs already had for centuries in Europe was far greater than anything we've had in this country. I won't go into all the financial details and how I know some of this, but enormous quantities of money, of gold, of wealth have existed, and it's all been maneuvered. It's all been controlled for a purpose. The real break in civilization, you might say, became obvious in the Industrial Revolution, and when the church's power was broken in 1500 A.D., when you had the Protestants, as they called them, Luther, John Calvin, and all the rest who followed, and the power of the Vatican was largely broken, not totally, but largely broken, and with it came the Renaissance and, of course, the development in an open style of the technology which was already known and held in secret. And this has been known for many, many centuries. You have knowledge of alchemy, which is a very advanced form of chemistry, and actually a very advanced form of matter manipulation, which was known to the ancients.
Vibrational chemistry.
You go back to Atlantis and elsewhere, you probably will find an older form of alchemy, which was very active in those days, in which they transmuted metals and all kinds of substances. That art has been largely lost. It is not lost totally. There are secret schools which still operate teaching alchemy. And you have, of course, now in modern scientific terms, you have the capability with these giant cyclotrons and atom smashers, you can transmute matter on a very small scale. And when it came to the development of the atomic bomb, they had to transmute matter on a large scale. Plutonium is a synthetic element. It exists in the atomic table, but beyond the 92 elements. And it is artificially created. And they had to create it in large amounts, and they gave them a great deal of trouble. But it's modern alchemy.
Are you implying that some of the plutonium from the bombs may have been created by the secret societies through purely alchemical?
No, I wasn't implying that. I was merely stating that the conversion of uranium to plutonium is, in essence, an alchemical process because you are changing one element into another.
But very crude.
In a crude but scientific manner, but in large amounts. That is, compared to alchemy, you are converting it. We do have the technology today to do this sort of thing. And it's not in the form of the older alchemy, which is a very difficult process to learn, but it is real. But we're now doing it. What else are we doing that the public doesn't know about? This is the problem. You have a two-tiered technology. It may be many tiers. You have had a two-tier technology for 200 or 300 years at least. Radio was used earlier than Tesla, who was given the credit for developing it and inventing it in 1893. It was used as early as 1847, if not earlier. In fact, it was used, according to some reports, in the Napoleonic Wars.
To manipulate the London Stock Exchange.
Right. and by other means to do some very fancy manipulation where the public and even the elite, for the most part, were not told what was going on. Only a few key people knew. These technologies have existed from ancient times, and they've been kept well hidden. They were not available to the masses because they didn't have the technological base to build them. These may have been leftover pieces of hardware. They may have been supplied by aliens. There may have been secret laboratories that produced them by ones and twos.
And not only this, but they were made. You have to have special technologies available only to the elite to continue their sense of control, their feeling of power. And every time a given technology is spread into the wider population, you have to present the next new toy for the elite. These higher levels of conspiracies that control the terrestrial elite, they never leave the guys without any new toys. It may be a new Nautilus submarine when everybody travels above surface and nobody even dreams of going underwater. It may be a program to land on the moon way before anybody even dreams of going there.
You know, it's like the British team exploration of the moon in 1897, 1898.
I'm very curious of what you have heard from your channels about this.
Well, there is an interesting story that went around. A friend of mine, Preston Nichols, and I can't talk about it now because he's not only no longer employed, he's blacklisted by the government totally. When he was still working with this company, AIL, I got into a discussion with him about earlier landings on the moon and Mars, namely the Alternative 3 story in the program. And he says he got discussing this with his boss one day at the company he worked at, AIL, one of the divisions of it on Long Island. And his boss looked at him curiously. He says, "You don't really know what's been going on." He says, "You don't know anything about the moon explorations of the last century."
With an illuminated smile on his face.
And of course, Preston Nichols, who was not usually jogged very much, probably dropped his jaw to the floor at that point because that was one he was not ready for, as much as he has been ready for. He says, "I couldn't pump anything out of the boss as to what really happened and who did it." But he implied it was just before the turn of the century that this actual exploration took place. Now we have the stories, also, we know about the Alternative 3 program, but there are also now documentaries which show that the Germans went to the moon and Mars in 1949 with the circular foil aircraft. Probably the rest of the engineering was perfected down in Antarctica because they prepared these bases in Antarctica in 1939 after the 2 years of exploration and moved there before the war collapsed. How many moved there, I don't know, but there are rumors that there were thousands of German troops moved into Antarctica and the prepared quarters they had. And they continue their manufacturing either down there or in one of the friendly South American countries, such as Argentina, as one example. But they finished the development. They made the circular foil aircraft. Pictures show them as quite large. Building in, if you can believe this, in 1943 aircraft, circular foil designs which were 75 meters in diameter and carried naval guns under the turrets underneath them. If not naval guns, Panzer-mounted guns from their tanks. And these are photographs which are clear enough to show that no extraterrestrial vehicle is going to carry naval guns or tank guns of a very normal and recognizable terrestrial design. These were not alien UFOs. These were German-built, terrestrially built, undoubtedly German because nobody else had the technology. When you see pictures of this, you see documentaries which show that they left and went to the moon and Mars in 49. One has to ask questions, maybe earlier. Where did they manage to complete this technology? Where did it get buried? Where have they been? Where else have they gone beyond the moon and Mars? And what have they done with this technology? Here. This is the big unknown.
And so this is actually the very reason I've been talking and researching the topic of German UFOs and the German secret space programs, because my feeling is that all behind the scenes, the United States and Germany during the war have been controlled by the very same power center. So on a one level up in the conspiratorial hierarchies, two bitter opponents and fighters, usually they're corrupt governments are controlled by the same power source. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union took part in a vast secret space program for exploration of the solar system and beyond, with flying saucers of basically the reality that we see on Star Trek. So it is very interesting to explore how these little conspiratorial levels go up through the hierarchies, leave the material terrestrial domain, and continue through the supermaterial to the non-terrestrial, through the extraterrestrial hierarchies and federations of united planets, all the way to the highest levels of celestial power structures. And so going back in time 100 years and discovering that there may have been a secret British space program, and a recent private interview with a Russian academician from a secret government research institute on anti-gravity basically gives the theoretical explanation of how this could have been done with a hybrid gun, rocket, and anti-gravity technology that the British could easily build at the end of last century. The big question is, if the British and later the Germans had that much and could go to the moon and Mars in 50 years ago, what do we have now? And so we naturally come back to the Philadelphia experiment and to the Phoenix project, because in my opinion, the Philadelphia experiment is not only invisibility and time travel, but it's a teleportation. It's a very important teleportation experiment where people can be beamed up and down from a ship to the surface of the planet. And even more, they can be beamed from one planet to another, totally bypassing the rocketry or the saucer technology, and basically putting the Earth on par with some of the more advanced extraterrestrial technologies. Even the Pleiadians have to use their craft in order to hop and fly from planet to planet. And obviously, some of these technologies were used exactly for that, for teleportation between different planets, and even for creation of these time tunnels or wormholes, wormhole tentacles that can be attached to another planet in our solar system or in a different solar system in our galaxy, basically to any point in our galaxy or to planets in other galaxies. It becomes an interesting celestial wormhole subway system that can transfer people and objects and material to any point in the universe. And this was the most astonishing finding for me after our lengthy talks here with Al. So I would be very glad if you can comment a little bit, and that would be actually the preparation for our next stay, because I see that we have just 6 minutes more left. So if you can give a little summary on these aspects of the Phoenix project.
All right, the Philadelphia experiment was really the granddaddy experiment that set the stage for everything that came after it, including the Phoenix project. But the peculiar part, of course, was that the Philadelphia experiment would not have created the disaster and also laid the groundwork for what came later if it had not been for the Phoenix project. It's a time loop problem. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? In terms of ordinary time, the Philadelphia experiment. Then came later the Phoenix project. What the Phoenix project in its final phases really accomplished was the creation of a transportation system in both space and time, which is capable of going anywhere in our galaxy, set a person, an object down, or pick a person or an object up and bring it back to the station, which was the primary one at Montauk.
Without a second station.
Without a second station.
To be on that planet.
No receiver.
One station transportation system.
Right. There was no receiver at the other end. None was required. All of the operation was done from the Montauk end. The technology for this was beyond terrestrial. It was alien technology, and there was a large contingent of aliens involved with the Phoenix project in developing the last phase of this the wormholes in space and time aspect. If any of you are familiar with Dr. Carl Sagan and his books and his commentaries on black holes and space, he talked about the possibility, maybe even the feasibility someday, excuse me, of creating wormholes in space and time for travel through the universe without having to go through all of the encumbrance of large ships and long, tiring voyages. We did it at Montauk. It was done in the period from 1977 until it crashed in '83. The project, by the way, has been replaced. It did crash on 12 August '83 because of various reasons, and sabotage being the primary one. But the project was moved to Germany, West Germany. There's an ongoing leg of it there. Additional stations, later ones, P8 and P9 is what they call them. When I say P8 and P9, P1 was the first phase of Philadelphia, which was mind control. P2 was the invisibility prospect. P3 was the program for the wormholes in space and time. There were other interim programs where they made some of this equipment portable. P7 is now on helicopters. It takes 3 large helicopters to do a mind control number over a whole city. And then you have P8 and P9, which is the newer fixed location Phoenix projects. I only have an idea where some of them are located. I do not know if they're operational. I think it's safe to assume they probably are. At least one of those 4 that I know of is at Lake Michaud, Louisiana area, and that, of course, is a huge NASA base. There are 2 more in the U.S. and 1 in Canada from my data. Whether any have been built beyond, I don't know. But Phoenix proved that you can transport a person and object through space-time. Let us say if you're going to go from one end of this galaxy, far out on one of the spiral arms near you are dealing with a distance of what is classed as 120,000 light years. Yet elapsed time. The person is inside the tunnel.
How about the
person
side of the tunnel?
Well, they won't. Actually, the tunnel goes through and functions as a link to whatever point you connect to, and is therefore, the time link is, for all practical purposes, essentially 0. It's not absolute 0. It may amount to minutes, depending on the distance.
Can the guy that was sent beam back radio message that yes, I arrived on the planet at this and this time, so that you would check?
Theoretically, he could. He could take a video camera with him. He could take a radio transmitter receiver setup, so they could communicate back, or they could use one of the superluminal communication systems, which has been conveniently developed during this period, where they now have a interplanetary and intragalactic communication system, which we didn't build all of, but which our government has access to, which is a C8 system. That means it travels at the speed of light to the 8th power across the galaxy with a phase shift, in a matter of a fraction of a second.
So
that's operational.
To any point of the galaxy without any lag.
That is operational, that system, and has been for years. In earlier form was the C6 system, which said there was some delay, and so they had to correct that. They wanted instantaneous communication.
Reach out and touch.
Right. You can go through Marvell if you got the right code numbers. But they're very, very restricted.